Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Thank you all for your ongoing support. We couldn't do this without you. For those of you who are not yet members of the Council Town Hall, there are some very unique benefits. For example, last evening, we had a members-only conversation with filmmaker Elizabeth Lowe, moderated by Kevin Getz, who is one of our board members and also CEO and founder of Screen Engine. This was a heartwarming movie about stray dogs in Istanbul and the ramifications of other homeless people in the region that just gave so much hope. If this is something that appeals to you, please go to our website and become a member. We thank you for all your support. If you have questions for Dan, there's a computer control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 30 minutes. It is now my pleasure to welcome you to Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with politics professor Dan Schnur. Dan, you have three terrific topics again today.
Well, Kim, we have a lot to cover as always, and so I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
So let me just cover those three topics and turn it right over to you. Firstly, Biden and the border, the debate over immigration reform. Is COVID relief turning out to be bipartisan after all? And third, China, Russia, and COVID, the global politics of vaccines. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks to all of you for being here with us today for another episode of Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. I think, Kim, we'd have to do the math, but I think we might actually be coming up on our 1-year anniversary since the shutdown. And it's been a really phenomenal experience for me, and I've been really heartened by how many of you have participated in these conversations each week and how much our group has grown over the course of the last 11 plus months. So topic number one, Biden and the border. And I'll start out by saying that from the very beginning of his presidency, Joe Biden and the people around him have understood that the success or failure of his presidency ultimately is going to be judged almost completely on how effectively or ineffectively he was perceived to have handled the coronavirus pandemic. So for weeks now, the White House has maintained an uncommon focus and a very single-minded discipline on that one topic. Biden has not announced any ambassadorial appointments. He's made little news internationally except when forced by events outside his control. And he and his team have made it very clear that the rest of his domestic agenda is going to wait until he's signed the COVID relief bill, which appears will be voted on by the House tomorrow. And so, assuming that Biden does sign the bill by the weekend, then at that point, we'll see him move on to other issues. But it's fairly uncommon for a president to focus so completely on just one matter for his first weeks in office. He hasn't held any news conferences where news might emerge on another topic. And he hasn't yet scheduled the traditional speech to a joint session of Congress that new presidents often deliver in the first month or so that they've been in office. Because they understand, as I said before, that at least right now, it's all about COVID for him. And so they have focused on that almost completely. But when you're president of the United States, you learn that events don't always wait for a convenient time on your calendar. George W. Bush was forced, of course, to deal with the terrorist attacks of September 11th at the beginning of his presidency, and Hurricane Katrina toward the end. Barack Obama had to confront unexpected crises in Syria and Libya and elsewhere. And Donald Trump, of course, had the pandemic and the accompanying recession overwhelm the last year of his presidency. And for Joe Biden, even though he's been focusing all of his public comments, or almost all of his public comments, on COVID, The situation at the US-Mexico border is very rapidly deteriorating. Make no mistake, Biden is right now staring down a crisis at the border that will almost certainly be much more difficult than similar challenges faced by his predecessors. Biden has pledged to create a more humane immigration system and to restore the asylum process. He's proposed legislation to legalize 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. But because Biden came into office articulating such a more welcoming set of policies, it shouldn't come as any surprise that desperate people from around the world have taken notice. And they've decided that crossing the border now might be easier than it was during the Trump administration, especially if children are making the attempt. And we'll talk more about children in particular in just a moment. Now, the underlying factors pushing immigration, poverty and violence, haven't gotten any better in Central America and Mexico in the last year. And in addition, the pandemic has devastated many of these nations' economies, not just in Latin America, but in developing nations around the world. But Central America in particular still faces horrible problems with crime, and they're trying to deal with international cartels, with extortion rings and kidnap gangs. And so what this all leads to is a huge delayed demand for individuals and families from these countries to come to the United States. Now, specifically, Biden reversed Trump's policy instituted after the COVID breakout. He reversed Trump's policy of turning away unaccompanied children. And that's the very group that's now surging. And many of these children are being held for days in border stations that most observers agree are unfit for children. We're seeing the highest level of unaccompanied minors into this country in 20 years. Shelters are overflowing, border crossings are rising, the border patrol facilities are overwhelmed, and the politics of this get extremely complicated. But even before we get to the politics of it, I want to ask you the question. So Claire, if you can put up our first question to get us started. What do you think? Will this border crisis be better, worse, or the same at the end of this year? Will Biden have been able to get a handle on things by the end of 2021 so that even if the situation isn't resolved, it's heading in the right direction? Or alternatively, does just the sheer number of individuals and families looking to make this trip across the border make it more difficult for him to get this under control in such short order? So Claire, let's see what our group thinks. Looks like a pretty close split, actually. 37% of you say that Biden will have been able to help improve the situation by the end of the year. 42%, only a slightly larger number, say it's going to get worse despite his administration's efforts. 21% say no change. So it looks like a split decision. And I might come back and push you on that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. Now, Biden's advisors, we're going to focus on migrant children for just a moment. Biden's advisors told him last week that the number of migrant children crossing the US border without their parents this year is likely to far exceed all previous records. I'll give you some math. In January, the Border Patrol was referring 47 children every day to the Health and Human Services Agency for care and for comfort. 47 children a day at the beginning of January. By the beginning of February, that number had risen to 203 children a day, more than 200 children a day who had been met by the Border Patrol and were being referred to Health and Human Services care. By last week, that number averaged 321 children per day. So let's do the math. Even if the numbers of children arriving do not continue to grow and stay at this very precise level, 321 children a day, and that is unlikely because the trajectory does seem to look like it's going to continue to go upward. But even if it stayed at 321 children a day, if you do the math, that's 117,000 children, unaccompanied minors, who will arrive in the country just this year by the end of 2021. And of course, these are just the children who the Border Patrol encounters. The real numbers are much, much larger. Now, the politics of this are unforgiving. Democrats look at the rising number of migrant children in these temporary facilities, including tents, and they see a betrayal of Biden's pledge to reverse Trump's immigration policies, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been very vocal on this front. Republicans look at the crush of migrants, and they see the inevitable result of Biden ending too many Trump policies too quickly, including the practice of expelling unaccompanied children and sending them back either to Mexico or to their home countries. Now, meanwhile, on the ground, you have immigration officials who have to balance real humanitarian needs against their duty to enforce immigration laws. And of course, the distancing requirements of COVID make it even more challenging. So in many ways, this influx of children is a new challenge, or at least it's a new complication to an old challenge. Because for decades, single adults, particularly men, represented the overwhelming majority of those who came into the country without documentation. But in recent years, the number of families and minors has increased substantially. Now, before the pandemic, migrant families and unaccompanied minors were a majority of those taken into custody at the southwest border, and now we're beginning to see those numbers rise again. Now, during the Obama administration, during the Trump administration too, most families were either quickly released in the United States or in more recent years deported. But some were held in basically dormitories for weeks or months, if not longer, so they could have their immigration proceedings. And advocates for these families have said that they are fleeing violence and poverty, and they shouldn't be detained at all. And that's exactly the message that candidate Biden delivered last year on the campaign trail. But now Joe Biden's president. And if the number of migrants continue to grow, it could very easily cause a backlash, not just with Republicans, but with many border area Democratic members of Congress, which would make it much harder for Biden to pass the kind of comprehensive immigration reform that he's called for. But if, on the other hand, he pursues a policy that discourages immigrants and their families, he'll face very, very difficult problems with his own party's base, particularly with Latino and Latino voters. Now, the politics of this are very interesting, but the most important thing to remember is that this is a humanitarian crisis. And regardless of the way Biden addresses it, the scope of this crisis could very likely set back the cause of immigration reform, maybe for months, maybe for years. So I'm going to come back to the question I asked you at the beginning of this section, where I asked you if you thought by the end of the year this crisis would have improved or gotten worse or stayed the same. So let's go to our next question. Same question, almost. Will the border crisis be better or worse or the same, not by the end of this year, but by the end of Biden's first term in office in 2024? So with a full 4 years to deal with this, do you believe that Biden and his administration will be able to get this crisis under control? Or does the sheer demand for entry into the United States mean that this is going to be a continuing challenge for him and for us going forward? And what do we got for results, Claire? Well, this is a more optimistic group today than we often see. 67%, two-thirds of our group today says that things will be better by the end of Biden's first term in office. Only 23%, a little bit less than one quarter, say worse. And we're down to 10% for no change. Well, let's go on to our second topic now. And for our second topic, we're going to talk about COVID relief because, as I mentioned earlier, it appears that Biden will be signing a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill by the weekend. So that focus we talked about at the beginning of the program today seems to have paid off. Now, this is an immense victory for the president, but it is one accomplished purely on partisan lines without any Republican support. And the question I'd ask for you is not just whether that matters, but Claire, if we can put up the next question, should Biden have done more to reach out to Republicans on the COVID bill? And the answer is not just yes or no, but I've offered a little bit of thinking behind each of these. Yes, Biden should have made more of an effort because even if it was a little bit less ambitious, it would be better going forward to have bipartisan support. Or no, Republicans wouldn't have supported him anyway. So he made somewhat of an effort at the beginning, and that was good enough. So what do all of you think? Well, look at that. 79% say it wouldn't have been worth the effort. Republicans wouldn't have come along anyway. Only 21% say maybe he should have scaled back a little bit in order to get some Republican support. Now, of course, the trick here is, as most of you know, Biden did pull back to some degree, but not to appease Republicans to get bipartisan support, but in order to achieve unanimous support from centrist Democrats. After Biden met with 10 Republican senators at the beginning of February to talk about the package, it didn't look like they had a lot more in the way of conversations with the GOP. And Biden's advisors saw poll numbers that showed overwhelming support for his relief package. And so they felt, bipartisan support would be nice, but it's not necessary. So they decided to move forward on a straight party line vote, as most of you advised, because they knew that if they could keep their caucuses together, unanimous support in the Senate, almost unanimous support in the House, that would be good enough to get the bill through. But of course, neither party is a monolith. And centrist Democrats like Joe Manchin of West Virginia, like Kristen Sinema of Arizona, and others began to voice their concerns about the relief package throughout February. And many of their objections were the same that Republicans had raised with Biden when they'd met with him at the beginning of last month. So Biden did make several concessions, again, not to Republicans, but to centrist Democrats. The first to go was a topic we've talked about before, was Biden's proposal to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Now, to be fair, a number of Republicans said that they would be willing to raise the minimum wage from its current $7.25. They just weren't willing to go up to $15. Most of their proposals were $10, $11, somewhere in that area. And by deciding to go with a straight party line vote through reconciliation, that led to a parliamentary ruling, which we talked about last week, that took any minimum wage component out of the bill. But I have to admit, what puzzled me, because Biden and the people around him are pretty savvy when it comes to Capitol Hill, what puzzled me a little bit is when Bernie Sanders did announce an amendment in the Senate to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, not only did all the Republicans vote against it, but no fewer than 8 Democrats, 7 Democratic senators, and Angus King, the independent from Maine who usually votes with Democrats, they all voted against the $15 proposal. And a week or two earlier, when there'd been a standalone bill on the minimum wage going to $15 an hour, 12 Democrats voted no. So I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure why the White House decided to push that on a party line basis, knowing that they wouldn't have had the votes to get up to $15 an hour, even with just Democrats, and that maybe in retrospect, it might have made more sense to raise the wage by a few dollars on a bipartisan basis. But there were other concessions as well that they made to get the support of centrist Democrats. After the minimum wage hike was dropped, Manchin and Sinema and others forced a narrowing of eligibility for stimulus payments so that people at a higher income were no longer eligible for the stimulus. They kept unemployment benefits at current levels instead of raising them up. And they imposed more specific guidelines on the state and local government aid that was part of the package. So the result is Biden managed to achieve a bipartisan bill without any Republican support. And you can point fingers at Biden or at the Republicans in Congress for that. But either way, I think it's important to note that while after refusing to give ground to Republicans, the White House did end up giving a lot of the same ground in order to get centrist Democrats. Now, make no mistake, even with these changes, the COVID-19 bill is still a testament to a traditional liberal version for expanded government. This is the largest sum of domestic government spending and the most targeted expansion of aid to low-income Americans in more than 50 years since Lyndon Johnson's presidency. Bernie Sanders tweeted that the legislation was, quote, the most progressive bill he's seen passed since he's been here, unquote. And Biden made a point of mentioning Sanders' tweet when Biden talked on Saturday about the bill's passage. So this is an immense accomplishment for Biden and for his allies. But again, it seems like a lot of the concessions that Biden made to Manchin would have been the same things he would have had to do in order to get Republicans on board. And now to complicate things further, Senator Manchin has already promised that he won't support infrastructure legislation, which is Biden's next big priority. Manchin will not support it unless there is more Republican involvement. So the White House is going to have to make a decision going forward whether Biden should make more outreach efforts toward Republicans or if he's content to move forward with just Democrats. Now, one thing we haven't talked about in this whole conversation is the filibuster, and that'll be one of our 3 topics next week. So get ready to discuss that and to offer your thoughts on the filibuster. But for now, let's keep an eye on Biden as he pivots from COVID to his infrastructure bill to see if he makes renewed efforts toward Republicans or if he continues down the path that brought him a victory on his COVID bill. Third and finally, our final topic is China, Russia, and COVID, the global politics of vaccines. Now, as all of you know, COVID vaccination campaigns have kicked off not just all over this country, but all over the world. And I'm hoping that as many of you as possible have begun to get your vaccinations. But while many wealthier developed countries are inoculating their populations at a pretty good rate, many countries in Latin America and Africa are really struggling. Governments in these continents, Latin America and Africa and elsewhere in developing countries around the world, their governments are desperate for vaccines, and they simply don't have the resources to procure them because wealthier countries have bought up most of at least the immediate supply. And so what's happened now is instead of looking to the United States for help, as might have been the case in the past, many of these countries are so far relying on the United States' most prominent global rivals, China and Russia. Now, this is a huge geopolitical advantage for both China and Russia. The vaccines are going to boost their reputations in regions where Beijing wants access to oil and agricultural products, and places where Moscow has been working to build stronger diplomatic and economic ties as well. And for the foreseeable future, both of these regions are almost entirely dependent on Chinese and Russian vaccines, which brings up a logical question. And so, Claire, let's put our next question to the group. What do you think? Should the United States be sharing vaccines with less wealthy countries, even if it means delaying vaccinations for our own citizens? Now, to be clear, the U.S. has made it clear, the Biden administration has made it clear that we will share vaccines with many of these other countries, but only after our own country is taken care of. Now, Biden has indicated that he believes that all adults who want to get vaccinated will be taken care of by the end of May, which would allow an international effort to start. But what do you think in the immediate? What's your thought? Only 38% of you think we ought to be sending the vaccines abroad right now rather than waiting to strengthen our international relationships. 62%. And as we've learned in the past, this is a somewhat left-leaning group that gathers here every week. But almost 2/3 of you say, let's finish taking care of our own citizens first and then reach out to the rest of the world. Now, this creates all sorts of complications. First of all, it's worth noting that the Chinese and Russian vaccines are less reliable, but they're easier to transport. And most importantly, they aren't required to be frozen at extremely low temperatures, the way 2 out of the 3 vaccines we're using in this country are. And both countries are certainly winning all sorts of diplomatic points. But even so, Most polls done in Latin America and in Africa show that in most of these countries, most residents of those countries would be much less willing to take a Russian or a Chinese vaccine than a Western alternative if it were available. But of course, it's not available. And so what happens now is these vaccines arrive from Russia and China, and they're received with huge fanfare, with political leaders welcoming the vaccines arriving and TV cameras on hand recording it all. And although the shipments tend to be very small, it really is creating a lasting pool of goodwill and influence for both Moscow and Beijing by stepping in when vaccines were at their most scarce. Now, as I said earlier, the United States and other wealthier countries are preparing to share doses internationally. You've read about the global COVAX initiative, which is crucial to vaccination, particularly in Central and South America, but in Africa as well. And they're going to start to ramp up distribution this month. And by sometime in April, that international effort will quickly surpass Russia and China as the largest source of vaccines for several countries. But in the meantime, first impressions are a lasting one. And as we've talked about in previous conversations about the various geopolitical challenges that the United States faces while looking to renew and to strengthen its relationships with countries around the world, this is going to be one more obstacle for President Biden and his administration when reaching out to these countries, because they're going to remember that when they needed those vaccines right at the outset, that Russia and China were there for them in a way that the United States wasn't. All right, so we're just about at the bottom of the hour. And so Jessica, if you'd be willing to rejoin me, let's shift from my diatribe into my favorite part of the conversation, when you and our listeners get a chance to weigh in. So what are we hearing from our audience today?
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions coming in. We'll get to the immigration topic first. What would future immigration reform look like? Are new laws being written for proposal to Congress?
Okay, so Biden, right after taking office, proposed what was almost certainly the most sweeping immigration reform package since 1986, when Ronald Reagan forwarded a bipartisan proposal that ultimately became law. And the primary feature of Biden's proposal was a pathway to citizenship for all undocumented immigrants currently in this country, which is estimated to be about 11 million of them. As I said earlier, though, the Biden administration hasn't put a lot of time and effort into this since that initial announcement, not because they don't want immigration reform, but because they're focusing all their time and attention and energies on the coronavirus and the pandemic and the vaccinations. But there was already a lot of conversation in Washington that building support, not just from Republicans, but even from more centrist Democrats for that type of ambitious immigration proposal is going to be unlikely for Biden to be able to accomplish. And what the administration is reportedly looking at now is more piece by piece reform, focusing on the dreamers, those young people who came here as children with their parents without documentation, helping those who are here because of temporary refugee status, as is now the case in Venezuela, but in many other countries around the world, and a proposal that would specifically focus on farm workers. And on one hand, some immigration advocates think that this is a smart way to go, because if you can't get the broader proposal, at least you can help these particular groups. But there's a lot of people and a lot of organizations across the political landscape who devoted a huge amount of time over the years to pressing for broader immigration reform, such as the type that Biden proposed with a pathway to citizenship for all those in this country undocumented. And their worry is that if Biden breaks this package into pieces, that only the low-hanging fruit, the dreamers and the farm workers and so on, will be taken care of, and the more ambitious proposal will end up going by the wayside.
All of the underlying problems triggering the border problems existed under Trump. So what explains the immediate jump in children in January and February? Biden's stated policy changes during the campaign just the absence of Trump or something else? In hindsight, were Trump's policies actually effective at discouraging immigration?
Well, a couple good questions in there. And I think it is important to acknowledge that while Trump's border policies came under severe criticism, it did have the impact of stemming some of the flow of migration because fewer people from other parts of the world decided it was worth the risk to try to come to the United States, only to be turned back either to Mexico or to their home country. Now, there's a discussion to be had that is taking place already about whether the humanitarian costs of that policy were appropriate or not. And that's a topic for us to address in more detail on another day. But while immigration, undocumented immigration, ebbed and flowed over the course of Trump's 4 years in office, depending largely on external factors independent of him, it is fairly clear that his more hardline approach did discourage that immigration flow. And the flip side of that is that when it became clear that Trump's successor was going to push for a more welcoming policy, that did cause a tremendous rise in interest and effort to cross the border. Now, the State Department is trying to let it be known in many of these affected countries, in Mexico and Central America and in other parts of the world, trying to discourage migrants from coming right now, basically saying, if you want to come to the US, you can, but now isn't the right time to come. And those efforts aren't having a great success so far. So I think it's the combination of Trump's harsher approach, which may have lessened the flow, in Biden's more welcoming message that has enticed so many more people to come. And so that's why we're seeing the numbers rise as quickly as they are.
How fast is the administration increasing the number of immigration judges? Also, how many judges do we need and who pays for that?
Okay, so the immigration judges are technically not part of the formal judicial system. They're hired independently of the type of judges we see dealing with matters in other federal courts. These are essentially federal government employees. And the Trump administration did hire large numbers of them, but often these are people who were hired, not surprisingly, whose views on immigration reflected that of President Trump. So on one hand, the Biden administration is looking for funds to increase the number of immigration judges to handle the larger numbers of arrivals. But on the other hand, there's also a large number of individuals already in these positions whose attitudes on immigration issues might be less reflective of Biden's approach than that of his predecessor. It's a great question, though, because while the most pressing need is a humanitarian need, one of the reasons that humanitarian crisis exists is because of a lack of judges. And the Biden administration, because of its focus on COVID, has not yet announced a budget proposal for next year. But I think it's safe to assume that when they do announce next year's budget proposal, we will see a very significant escalation in the amount of money spent on individuals for these positions.
Can you comment on why Secretary Mayorkus and the Biden administration will not allow reporters to tour the child migrant detention facilities? This is a major issue the last few years with the kids in cages, and yet there seems to be a lack of transparency when the same thing is happening under a new administration.
Well, my guess, and it's just a guess, is that Mayorkus and other high-ranking officials in the Biden administration have come to the conclusion that just as those pictures and those videos of children behind linked fence caused such consternation during the Trump presidency, they worry that the same type of pictures would cause just as much of a public outcry. As I mentioned earlier, the number of unaccompanied minors who are coming to this country has just exploded, and the administration is simply not prepared for them. They're scrambling as quickly as they can to open up facilities so they can house these children somewhere. But a lot of these facilities, albeit temporary, aren't all that different than those that have been used in previous years. And my guess is, and again, it is just a guess, is that Biden's appointees have decided that being somewhat restrictionist in access to these temporary facilities, while not ideal, is preferable for them than the public relations crisis that would almost certainly emerge if we did begin to see similar pictures under President Biden that we did under President Trump. So they've made it clear that they're working as hard as they can to resolve this situation, to create more livable facilities for these children to live in until they move on to the next step. But while that scramble is taking place, my guess is the pictures we're not seeing are pretty similar to the ones that we saw a year or two or three ago.
Everyone agrees that there needs to be immigration reform, but the two parties disagree on what needs to be done to fix the problem. Since a significant percentage of the American people agree on passing a bill to protect the Dreamers, why don't the Democrats pass a clean bill regarding the Dreamers rather than proposing a more complex bill that would be much harder to pass?
Well, and that may be where the Biden administration is headed, is for the Dreamers and probably for farm workers also. Those are two categories of individuals who there would be very likely appropriate level, a necessary level of bipartisan support in order to pass reforms. The concern, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is that for those who very badly want broader immigration reform, including a pathway to citizenship, not just for the Dreamers or the farm workers or those with temporary refugee status, but for all undocumented immigrants, their worry is that if legislation passes that would only help the most popular undocumented immigrants, that would become even harder to pass a more comprehensive bill. So this is a conversation, this is an argument going on within the Biden administration right now, which is, do you go big even in the face of potential challenges, or do you move forward purposefully, incrementally, even if it means that the likelihood of broader success becomes less? My prediction, as much as I hate to make predictions, I'll make an exception here, Jessica. I think it's fairly likely that the Biden administration will take the questioner's advice and go ahead with more piece-by-piece reform, because at least that way they can make some progress, even if the broader changes still remain unresolved.
A number of questioners are asking about things that the Biden administration or the US could do to help Central American countries to improve the life there. So maybe immigration would be less. There was one suggestion of the Caribbean Basin Initiative in 1984, which helped to curb immigration by creating textile jobs in Northern Central America. Is that anything that the Biden administration is looking into?
And in fact, it is. One of the lesser noted aspects of Biden's immigration reform proposal, because the pathway to citizenship has gotten so much attention, is the proposal also does direct certain amounts of economic and other types of aid to Central American countries that are suffering from these economic and public safety crises. I think there's a broad recognition that ultimately the best way to resolve this immigration crisis is to create a better situation for these individuals and families in their home countries, so that they can live, so that they can work, so that they can live safely, so they don't feel so pressured to come here in search of something better. So while there's a very long and heated debate ahead as to how much aid the U.S. should provide to those countries, even Biden's original proposal did include funds for El Salvador, for Guatemala, and for Honduras, as well as other countries where their residents face similar types of challenges.
Do we know anything about the age distribution of the unaccompanied minors? Are they mostly late teenage range or younger? Do we know what the age looks like?
Well, I don't have a specific breakdown, but historically, the age of unaccompanied minors does tend to skew in the teenage years, if only because it's easier for a young man or young woman in their teens to navigate without their family than it would for a younger child. But there are just heart-wrenching photos of much younger children who may not have come all the way from their hometown or home country by themselves, but when they and their parents arrived at the US-Mexico border, their parents made the excruciating decision to send a younger child across the border alone because it increased their chances of being able to stay in the United States. So it is something that tends to lean more heavily towards teens than for preteens and younger children, but there's still a really horrific number of young kids who come here on their own too.
Thank you. I apologize. There's a loud helicopter flying overhead, so if you hear that, my apologies. This questioner says, what do most Americans want in terms of immigration legislation? Aren't most people tired of listening to this saga? Do you think that those in public opposed to broad legislation have that perspective because despite promises at the time of Reagan legislation, illegal entry continued?
That's one of the arguments they hear most frequently from opponents of comprehensive immigration reform. People who say that in the 1980s, they told us that if broad-based amnesty were accomplished, that then there wouldn't be a continued influx of undocumented immigrants. That is the argument that political leaders in both parties, both Reagan administration officials and Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill, made when the Simpson-Mazzoli bill passed back in 1986. But if you look back, it's easy to see that it wasn't a particularly realistic promise for them to make, because providing legal status for all those who are currently in the country couldn't have possibly addressed all those who had not come here. But it is something that you hear frequently from those who oppose the comprehensive legislation. What do the polls show? The polls show, as the previous questioner implied, very, very broad support for allowing the dreamers, the young people who came here as children, undocumented with their parents, to become citizens. There's a slightly lower level, but still considerable level of support for those coming under temporary refugee status, those coming from war-torn areas and other extremely difficult circumstances in which not just their livelihoods, but their lives were in danger. After that, it gets somewhat more divided. On one hand, we do see majorities that support a pathway to citizenship for all undocumented immigrants. And the pathway includes learning English, not getting in legal trouble, having a job, joining the military, steps like that along the way. It's a majority, but it's not a huge majority. And it is worth noting that of all the executive orders that Biden has issued since taking office, the ones that have attracted the least support tend to be those having to do with immigration. So the country generally leans toward wanting to be helpful, but not by overwhelming margins. And as is the case with so many matters of public policy, a small number of people who oppose a policy change can often end up having more impact in the discussion than a larger number of people who support that change without as much resolve and engagement. So the polls might help us with the dreamers and those with temporary refugee status. After that, it gets more complicated.
What do liberals really want with regard to immigration? Do they want totally open borders? If not, what do they want, or are they really more interested in using this as a tool to garner progressive support?
Well, I'm always wary about painting any very broad-based ideological movement, either liberals or conservatives or moderates, with one brush. There are some liberals, there are some of the most progressive voices in the discussion who do believe that a border is an artificial barrier and that individuals and families ought to be able to come and go in between countries as they please. The majority of Democratic support, whether you classify that as liberal or not, is something for each of you to decide. The majority of Democrats, according to public opinion polling, do believe that there ought to be some type of requirements for coming into this country legally, and that there ought to be some type of requirements if an individual came without documentation to become legal. Where you then get into is less of a set of absolutes, let everyone come versus let no one come. You end up with shades of gray in which you ask yourself, what should be the process in which someone comes here legally, and what should be the process that someone can transition once they're here from undocumented to legal status. So you do hear some voices on the left who do think that a completely open border is appropriate, but the majority of Democratic voters do recognize the need for some type of border control efforts.
What has been the response to the border crisis by the Mexican government, in particular when Biden denied providing them vaccines they needed in light of the U.S. dealing with a shortage?
Well, during the Trump administration, the Mexican government actually became very cooperative with Trump, wanting the United States support on any number of issues. And for the first time, really, the Mexican government began making more of an effort to prevent migrants from coming over their southern border from Central America and other places, and began imposing more restrictions on the flow of undocumented immigrants within their country. Obrador and Biden do not have a particularly strong relationship, and as the questioner correctly notes, the relationship wasn't helped when the White House told Mexico that we were not going to be making vaccines available to them and their people in the immediate future. The one thing that's changed, the most notable thing that's changed since Biden became president, is Mexico is no longer willing to accept unaccompanied children who are sent back from the United States into Mexico. And so that's added yet another contributing factor to the growth of those numbers in this country. I don't know where this relationship goes going forward, and it probably isn't a bad idea for us to revisit a conversation about the U.S. relationship with Mexico and Latin America, because it's been a couple months since we've talked about it. But I'd say somewhat vaguely, it's still an open question on how cooperative Mexico is willing to be with the U.S. on these questions. They cooperated with Trump under some duress. It's less clear on whether they'll be more cooperative with as cooperative with Biden's approach.
We have so many more questions on immigration. I don't know if you want to keep going or if we should focus on some of our other topics.
Why don't we go on to another topic, just out of fairness to everybody else, people who wrote in on those other topics. But it's a good lesson that we'll need to come back to the immigration issue again in the future so we can discuss it in more depth and detail.
Thank you. Yeah, and those who sent in those questions, I'll try to gather those up and hopefully we can address them in a future webinar. But thank you for all of your great questions. Given the lockstep GOP opposition to the COVID stimulus bill, does Biden really have a shot at gathering more GOP support for the infrastructure economic growth bill? Or if he wants to succeed, will he have to go against his wish and abolish the filibuster, at least for this bill, and pass it with 50 votes?
I think we'll be much better prepared to answer that question even in a week or two than we are today. Because once Biden signs the COVID bill, which he will do by this weekend, and begins to shift his attention to infrastructure and economic development, we'll see pretty early on whether he's interested in a renewed effort to win over Republicans. I suspect he will try again, if only because at a certain point he has to. Manchin made that very clear earlier this week or over the weekend, when Manchin said that he would not support an infrastructure bill that didn't involve more Republican participation. So Biden really has no choice, because without Manchin, he's not going to be able to get 51 votes in the Senate. But it's pretty clear from watching Biden over his campaign and over the years that temperamentally his preference would be to try to find a way to accomplish some of these things in a bipartisan manner. And because a lot of the types of things that Biden is talking about, not just traditional infrastructure like roads and bridges, but also broadband access, for example, and rural healthcare, these are issues that would disproportionately benefit Republican constituencies. And so while it's impossible to guess where the bill is going to turn out, I would be surprised if Biden didn't make a more sustained effort to reach out to Republicans on this next step than he did on COVID.
What elements of the new stimulus bill differ from the original CARES Act, which Republicans supported?
Okay. Well, any number of changes. Number one, Republicans did voice great concern about both the amount of money going to state and local government, but also whether there should be some type of parameter, some type of restrictions on how it was spent. But most of the other changes, and the questioner makes a very valid point, most of the changes in the minds of Republican have less to do with the content of the bill than the situation. And I think what most Republican senators and House members who voted against the bill, who are opposing this bill, would argue is that shortly after the shutdown, there was an economic crisis that required immense amounts of immediate aid. And you hear many Republicans now making the case that as the economy begins to recover, while there should still be some aid, it should be more targeted, and it should be sent to more specific sectors and more specific recipients. So their primary argument is we're getting closer to a reopening and therefore an economic recovery. And so therefore maybe not as much needs to be spent as was the case last spring and summer. Many Republicans also point out that large amounts of the money that were allocated, not just in the December bill, but in previous COVID relief bills, have not yet been spent, or have not and have not yet been designated for spending. Just to be clear, I'm not taking the Republican side, but the question was where Republicans are on this. So while I do my best to not take sides in these type of discussions, these are the types of arguments I'm hearing from opponents of the legislation, not just Republican members of Congress, but some economists who've begun to worry about possible inflationary impact of the bill and wondering if the bill might not have made more sense to be a little bit less expansive and to save some of that money for infrastructure legislation down the line. But fair question but that is a fair question. And I think it is worth noting that many aspects of the bill are similar to what Republicans voted for last summer. And again, Republicans would argue that was under a different set of circumstances.
Should the U.S. take any particular stand regarding sharing vaccines with countries such as Brazil, whose president continues to deny the severity of the pandemic? And another questioner asked a similar question regarding U.S. states such as Texas and Mississippi about affecting how we distribute vaccines to those states.
Okay. Let's start with the international question, because I think they're fairly different. They're fairly different challenges. I don't know that it would make a lot of sense to decide whether or not to help a country with a vaccination effort based on the attitudes and affiliations of its leader. If you're going to help, another country, it should be because of that country's needs, and you may decide to wait to provide that relief until after we've provided more vaccines to our own citizens. But I'd be uncomfortable with an approach that prioritized some countries over the other, not because of need, but because of past statements or actions by their leaders. In other words, if the Brazilian leadership were willing to make the vaccines available to its citizens to the same degree that other South American and Central American countries would, then I think it would be, I'm not sure it would be a great idea to exclude them because of the past controversies that have existed there over the course of the pandemic. As far as individual states, we have a federalist system, which ultimately allows states to make these decisions for themselves. And you can see how frustrated Biden is, understandably. He's working as hard as he possibly can to move the vaccination process forward much more quickly than it had been in the past. And he's very worried and has articulated his concern that some governors are so eager to reopen that they might undermine the progress that's being made. Short of sending in federal troops, I don't know that there's anything that the president or the White House can do to require governors to conduct themselves in a certain way. But it's interesting that in the state of Texas, for example, we're seeing a lot of local government officials who've pushed back against Governor Abbott, saying that they believe that his decision to lift the mask mandate in that state is not something that they want for their constituencies. So a bully pulpit and a set of incentives is probably the best the federal government can do with a recalcitrant state in this situation. And it's not ideal, but whenever a state has a governor of a different party than the president of the United States, you generally see these types of conflicts emerge, albeit not on such high stakes matters.
Only 20% of the stimulus bill will go to COVID relief, the rest on liberal policies. Is not that the real reason for Republican non-support?
Well, this is one of the primary arguments that Republicans have made, and it's one that I should have raised earlier. In addition to the points that I talked about a few minutes ago, we have heard Republicans point to any number of items in the package that, while they may or may not be a good expenditure of federal government funds, are not directly COVID related. And to some degree, the Republicans were successful on this front. There was money for the extension of BART, the transit system up in the Bay Area, and a similar system in upstate New York. And the argument was, hey, these transit measures may or may not be good things, but what do they have to do with COVID? And so the Democrats took them out of the bill, less because of Republican objections and more because of concerns among centrist Democrats. There is a lot in this bill that is going to be part of our lives long after the pandemic has passed, no question about it. And I guess the quicker version of a broader point, the quicker point I'd make is a placeholder for a broader discussion, is times of crises like these, the Great Depression, a world war, tend to reorient the way the public feels about government involvement in society. And just as the Great Depression ushered in a very expansive liberal view of government, and just as we saw a shift toward conservatism through the 1980s and the remainder of the 20th century and early 21st century, this type of crisis environment has built a great deal of public support for a more ambitious government. And Biden is very clearly using the pandemic in order to make strides on some of his policy priorities that are not directly COVID related. But it's worth noting he's doing so with very broad public support, including majorities of Republican voters, who, while they may be focusing specifically on the stimulus checks and some of the other more high-profile items in the COVID relief package, are supporting the overall bill. So the questioner is exactly right. Some of it's COVID related, some of it is broader, but it's pretty clear that Biden does have fairly broad public support for this effort. And it's not surprising that a new president wouldn't take advantage of it.
Thank you so much, Dan. I know we've taken you again right to the end of the hour, and we have so many questions that are still coming in, but that will mean that we just all have to come back next Tuesday. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn this back over to Kim.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Jessica. Dan, thank you so much for leading us through yet another excellent discussion. We've got to come back on immigration. I think we have another program that we want to do on voting rights. So I think we're going to be keeping you busy.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, and we'll just take 3 pieces at a time every week. And so
Thank you, Dan.
next week we'll talk about the filibuster. We'll probably talk about, for the first time, about Biden's infrastructure and jobs package, since that will take center stage once the COVID bill is signed. And between Jessica and you and Claire and me, Kim, we'll figure out what else to bring up next week, and hopefully we'll come up with something that our group likes.
We have a long list, thankfully. For our viewers, please help us keep these very important programs ongoing by supporting us with a donation. Just simply text the name Schnur to the number in the chat that's in your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We do have a terrific lineup of programs already getting booked in March and April. I just want to highlight a few of those. Tomorrow, Protest and Repression Around the Globe. This is a roundtable discussion on Hong Kong, Thailand, Russia, and Belarus. Next week, in addition to Politics in the Time of Coronavirus on Tuesday with Dan, we have Opportunities and Challenges in the United States Foreign Policy. This is a fireside chat with Michelle Flournoy, who's a former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. On the 18th, we have Samantha Gross, who's a director at the Brookings Institution, who will be focusing on energy, geopolitics, and climate. And later in March, we have Ava Homa, author of Daughters of Smoke and Fire. And we have Jane Harmon from the Woodrow Wilson Institute, who will be focusing on, this is an interesting title we have, Insanity Defense, Why Our Failure to Conflict Hard Natural Security Problems makes us less safe. We have a lot. So please go to our website, register for upcoming programs, become a member, make a donation, stay safe, stay informed, and hope to see you guys tomorrow. Take care. Thank you, Dan.